Let's talk, if we can, for a minute about the speakership era and E.D. O'Brien.
When we were in the minority with 37, we very carefully kept track of all the votes, and we also set up votes if we needed to make a point. And we worked very hard and we figured that in the election and whatever had happened, that we could affect the election maybe 2 or 3 seats one way or the other. And it just so happened that 1966 was a super year for the Republican Party, and instead of picking up 15 seats, we picked up 18, and that gave us a tie, 55-55. And my reasoning at that time, and the reasoning of our caucus, was that that since we had the governorship and the Senate, and we were the responsible party, that we at least ought to have the ability to control the flow of the legislature, even though that we didn't have enough votes to pass anything. And we just were adamant about that, and we wouldn't give in. And in the meantime, over the years, E.D. O'Brien, who was from the east side of Detroit, was never very enamored with the UAW, and that was some other things. He just decided he was going to sit on his hands if they were going to put up somebody like Bill Ryan, with whom I'm very close and very fond of, but he's a UAW guy. And so he just didn't vote, and we won the speakership 55-54, with Danny Cooper screaming that it was unconstitutional, but of course it isn't. You have to pass a bill with 56 votes. You don't have to elect. You can elect a speaker 1-0, but that's the way it was. And then unfortunately, 2 of us died. Jim Nunley and then Joe Kowalski, a Republican and Democrat, and we picked up both of those seats. So we had a technical majority of 56. That's not a working majority.
Well, that was my next question. How did it function? How did the House function? Did it function well, or were
beautifully? It functioned beautifully. I had a system of committee stuff that's never been done before or since. I had a Ouija board outside my office that was copied from Marty Booth's charts of how he kept track of his milk from his cow. And I had a list of committees across the top and list of the members, or list of the members across the top and the committees down there. And I had pins as to what their competency was, what their wishes were, what their experience was, and the black pin was my final choice. Now that Ouija board was open to every member, all the public, the press, the whole ball of wax. Everybody was happy. And the Democrats refused to accept my offer to allow them to appoint the people wherever they wanted to, which I did when I was minority leader. For the first time in the history of Michigan, the minority said where they wanted their members to go. That's the way they do it in Congress. And I figured that I had a responsibility, if I was minority leader, to put guys where I knew they would do the best for the people. And that's what I did. And Joe Kowalski went along with that.
During your legislative career, there were a whole host of things: taxes, civil rights, environmental bond issues. You want to elaborate on some of the ones that you think were, probably the most important? And
well, here's from my campaign stuff. This is the campaign material that I had. This is my whole campaign piece. I said we start by putting the backbone back into state government. Among the legislation passed this term are laws providing for fiscal reform, implied consent, that's the drunk driving deal, a good roads package, and I didn't even mention reducing the fees on the Mackinac Bridge. We just did that as an aside. crime and riot prevention, open housing, tenants' rights, lower court reorganization, Sunday liquor, major improvements in aid to higher education and school aid, legislation against crime, and for exchange of information by grand juries, court hearings on Ionia inmates, that's by the criminally insane, to protect society from premature release, reorganization of state military structure, anti-pollution legislation covering both air and water, a bill to submit to a vote a bond issue for vast improvements in parks and recreation facilities, and conflict of interest legislation. And then I got a whole thing in this campaign about the open housing business. And that didn't even mention the income tax, which we had to do, but I've mentioned that here, where it would, there were only 6 of us in the House, 4 of us in the legislature that had a record which would be compatible with voting no on an income tax. Only 4. And we got into deep trouble fiscally, and there wasn't any way that we could get out of it except on income tax, and that's what we had to do. I happen to have been one of those 4, but I led the fight for the income tax. We had an unbelievably constructive session, and I have every reason to be proud of my part in it. Of course, we did have a Senate, yes. And we did have a governor, and the governor was a big leader, and Governor Romney was a super guy to work with, very easy to work with, unlike what a lot of people think. And so it was just fun putting all this stuff together.
Romney also had a pretty solid staff too, didn't he? I mean,
yeah, and they were fun to work with too. And he did not have yes people around him at all. I can remember once we had a meeting. There were 18 of us in the room, and Romney and Allison Green was Speaker of the House. Romney and Allison Green wanted to do something, and I said, I don't think we ought to do that. And Dick Van Dusen was the governor's legal advisor, and he says, I agree with Bob. And so we discussed this thing for a while, and it was 16-2 against the Speaker of the House and the governor. And Romney just laughed and threw up his hands. He said, let's go on to the next subject. Well, now that's pretty nice. Yeah. You know, that's pretty good stuff. You know, I can't imagine Janowitz doing that, but I can imagine Charlie DeBona doing that.
Talk about the Detroit riots for a moment and what you mentioned, the coordinating.
Well, that was an extremely interesting period and a tragic period. And we had a horrible riot in Detroit during the war. I was overseas at the time. I think this was in '44. It was really bad. And I think we all could take judicial notice of how it started and stuff. But for some reason, because of the good operation of the state police or other information gathering services, there was some suspicion that there was a problem. So when the legislature adjourned or recessed in '67, we were still working on the income tax, I think, so we recessed for a while. This is close to the truth. We signed some papers that Bob Danhoff put together, who was then the governor's legal advisor, that said that we wouldn't be able to call the legislature back into session immediately on the drop of the hat. And we did that because the Constitution of the United States says that the United States forces can be brought in a riot at the request of the governor only if the legislature's not in session. And then it has to be at the request of the legislature. Okay. And so we wanted to make sure that the legislature couldn't ask for